Last Tuesday evening, I sat in the bathroom stall of Romano's Italian Bistro, tears streaming down my face as I listened to my own family discuss how much they dreaded being seen with me in public. What I discovered that night would lead me down a path I never imagined possible, one that would transform me from the family embarrassment into the woman who owned their shame. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Vasquez, and at 58 years old, I had spent the better part of 3 decades trying to fit into a world that seemed determined to remind me I didn't belong. Growing up in a working class family in East San Antonio, I learned early that restaurants were special occasions, places where you wore your best clothes and spoke in hushed tones. Even after building my successful accounting firm and accumulating more wealth than I'd ever dreamed possible, I still felt like that little girl pressing her nose against the window of fancy establishments, wondering what it would be like to belong. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very family I'd worked so hard to provide for had become my harshest critics. My daughter, Isabella, with her MBA from Northwestern and her executive position at a tech startup, often rolled her eyes when I asked the server too many questions about ingredients. My son Miguel, a successful surgeon who'd inherited his father's refined tastes, would physically cringe when I accidentally used the wrong fork or spoke too loudly about my excitement over a particularly good meal. But it was my sister Carmen who delivered the most cutting remarks, always wrapped in the guise of helpful advice. She'd married well, moved to the affluent suburb of Alamo Heights, and somehow appointed herself as the family's etiquette police. Every family gathering became a masterclass in my inadequacies, with Carmen pointing out my pronunciation of wine names, my tendency to ask for extra sauce, or my habit of complimenting the staff too enthusiastically. The breaking point came during what was supposed to be a celebration dinner for my grandson's acceptance into medical school. I had reserved a table for 8 at Romano's, one of the most upscale Italian restaurants in the city, wanting to mark this milestone with the kind of dinner my family would remember. I'd spent hours getting ready, wearing the expensive black dress Isabella had helped me pick out months earlier, and I'd even practiced the pronunciation of several wine names I'd researched online. Everything started normally enough. We were seated at a beautiful table near the window, the kind of spot I'd specifically requested when making the reservation. The restaurant buzzed with the soft conversations of well-dressed diners, and I felt a familiar flutter of nervousness mixed with excitement. This was exactly the kind of place I dreamed of dining in as a child, and here I was, not just eating there, but treating my entire family. The trouble started when I began asking the server, a young man named David, about the specials. I wanted to understand what made each dish unique, partly out of genuine curiosity and partly because I was still learning to navigate these sophisticated menus. When he mentioned the osso buco was braised in a traditional Milanese style, I asked what made it different from other preparations I'd heard about. I noticed Isabella exchange a glance with her husband James across the table. Carmen cleared her throat softly and touched my arm, whispering that perhaps we should just order quickly since the restaurant seemed busy. But I was genuinely interested in the food, and David seemed happy to explain the cooking process. When I asked if the risotto could be made without wine since I didn't drink alcohol, Carmen's face flushed pink. The evening continued with small moments of tension I couldn't quite understand. When my seafood pasta arrived and I exclaimed how beautiful the presentation was, asking David to thank the chef personally, I caught Miguel closing his eyes briefly as if in pain. When I asked for Parmesan cheese for my salad and learned they had several varieties available, my enthusiasm for trying them all seemed to make everyone else at the table uncomfortable. The final straw came when I noticed my pasta was slightly overcooked. Having worked in restaurants during college, I knew this happened sometimes, and I politely asked David if I could have it remade. I wasn't rude about it, simply explaining that it was a bit too soft for my preference. But the reaction from my family was immediate and visceral. Isabella actually put her head in her hands. Carmen whispered something to her husband Roberto that made him nod grimly. After finishing our main courses, I excused myself to use the restroom, still puzzled by the strange tension that had settled over our table. As I walked toward the back of the restaurant, I felt a sense of unease I couldn't shake. Something was wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what I'd done to cause such discomfort among the people I loved most. The women's restroom at Romano's was elegantly appointed, with marble countertops and soft lighting that was meant to be flattering. I had just entered one of the stalls when I heard familiar voices entering the outer area. My heart stopped when I recognized Carmen's voice, followed by Isabella's distinctive laugh. I honestly don't know how much more of this I can take, Carmen was saying, her voice carrying the kind of exasperation usually reserved for discussing particularly difficult children. Did you see how she interrogated that poor server? And asking for the risotto without wine like we're at some chain restaurant? Isabella sighed heavily. The cheese thing was what got me. She asked about 3 different types of Parmesan like she was conducting a tasting seminar. I wanted to disappear under the table. And sending back the pasta. In a restaurant like this, you just don't do that unless something is seriously wrong. Everyone was looking at our table. I pressed my hand against my mouth to stifle any sound, my heart pounding so loudly I was afraid they might hear it. These were my daughter and sister, the women I'd spent my life trying to make proud, and they were discussing me like I was a source of shame. Mom just doesn't understand that there are rules to these places, Isabella said, and I could hear her moving around, probably checking her makeup in the mirror. She treats every restaurant like it's the corner taqueria where she grew up. It's embarrassing.
The worst part is how oblivious she is, Carmen added. She genuinely thinks she's being friendly and engaged, but she's making us all look like we don't belong here either. People are going to associate us with her behavior. Isabella made a sound of agreement. James mentioned it after last month's dinner at the Palm. He said some of his colleagues were there and saw the whole thing, with Mom asking the sommelier to explain every wine on the list. He was mortified. Something has to be done, Carmen said firmly. We can't keep doing these family dinners at nice places if she's going to act like this. It reflects on all of us, and frankly, it's not fair to the staff or other diners. But how do we tell her? Isabella asked. You know how sensitive she gets about anything that sounds like criticism. She'll just say we're being snobby or that we've forgotten where we came from. Carmen's voice took on the tone she used when she'd made up her mind about something. We don't tell her directly. We just stop doing these upscale restaurant dinners. Suggest more casual places, or better yet, just do family gatherings at home. Eventually, she'll get the message. That seems cruel, Isabella said, though her voice lacked conviction. What's cruel is subjecting everyone to these performances, Carmen replied. I love Elena, you know I do, but she needs to understand that her behavior is inappropriate for certain settings. If she can't learn to fit in, then we need to protect ourselves and our reputations. I heard the sound of purses being gathered and footsteps moving toward the door. Just before they left, Isabella spoke one more time, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes I wonder if we made a mistake letting her pay for these expensive dinners. It's like she thinks buying the meal gives her the right to act however she wants. The door closed behind them, leaving me alone in the marble-appointed restroom with the echo of their words ringing in my ears. I sat there for several minutes, trying to process what I'd just heard. My own family, the people I'd sacrificed for, worked endless hours to provide for, and loved unconditionally, saw me as an embarrassment they needed to manage and contain. The walk back to our table felt like a death march. Every step reminded me of the words I'd just heard, and I found myself looking at the other diners with new eyes. Had they really been watching our table with judgment? Had my questions to the server seemed inappropriate to them? Was my excitement about the food really so inappropriate for this setting? When I reached our table, dessert menus had already been distributed and the conversation had moved on to Miguel's latest research project. Everyone looked up as I approached, their smiles bright and welcoming, giving no indication of the conversation that had just taken place. The performance of family harmony resumed seamlessly, but now I could see it for what it was, a performance. Carmen immediately began discussing the dessert options, her voice warm and inclusive, as she asked what I thought about sharing the tiramisu. Isabella complimented my dress again, the same dress she'd helped me choose but apparently now saw as part of my problem.
Miguel asked if I was enjoying my meal, his concern seeming genuine despite what I now knew about his embarrassment. I played my part, smiling and nodding, participating in the conversation while internally reeling from the revelation. When the check arrived, I reached for it automatically, as I always did. It was my way of showing love, of proving that I belonged in their world, even if I'd started from humble beginnings. But now I wondered if my generosity was seen as presumptuous, another sign that I didn't understand my place. The drive home that night was torture. I kept replaying every moment of the evening, analyzing each interaction through the lens of what I now knew my family really thought of me. Had I really been that inappropriate? Was asking questions about the food so terrible? Was my enthusiasm genuinely embarrassing, or were they just impossibly judgmental? By the time I reached my house in Terrell Hills, a beautiful property I'd bought after my business became successful, I felt more alone than I had since my husband died 5 years earlier. This house, with its perfectly manicured lawn and elegant interior, had been my proof that I'd made it, that I deserved to be in the same social circles as my sister and successful children. Now it felt like a monument to my failure to truly belong anywhere. I poured myself a glass of wine, the same type I'd been too embarrassed to order at the restaurant after Carmen's subtle discouragement, and sat in my living room staring at the family photos that lined the mantelpiece. Every image showed smiling faces and happy occasions, but now I wondered how many of those smiles had been forced, how many times my family had tolerated rather than enjoyed my company.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The next morning brought no relief from the crushing weight of what I'd discovered. I went through my usual routine of checking emails from my accounting firm, reviewing client files, and managing the investments that had made me wealthier than anyone in my family realized. But every task felt meaningless against the backdrop of knowing that the people I'd worked so hard to impress saw me as a source of shame. I found myself thinking about Romano's specifically, remembering how beautiful the restaurant had looked, how professional the staff had been, how much I genuinely enjoyed the atmosphere despite my family's discomfort. It was exactly the kind of place I dreamed of dining in as a child, and I'd finally reached a point in my life where I could afford to eat there regularly if I wanted to. But apparently, having the money wasn't enough. There were unspoken rules, social codes that everyone else seemed to understand instinctively, while I stumbled through them like a bull in a china shop. The realization was devastating, but it also sparked something else, a burning curiosity about these rules and the people who enforced them. Over the next few days, I found myself researching Romano's online, reading reviews, looking at their social media presence, trying to understand what made it the kind of establishment where my behavior was so inappropriate. What I discovered was fascinating and infuriating in equal measure. Romano's was part of a small chain of upscale Italian restaurants owned by Castellano Restaurant Group, a family business that had been operating in Texas for over 30 years. They prided themselves on authentic cuisine, exceptional service, and maintaining an atmosphere of refined dining that attracted the city's elite. Reading through the reviews, I began to see patterns in the complaints. Several reviewers mentioned feeling intimidated by the formal atmosphere. Others noted that the servers seemed impatient with questions, and a few specifically called out the restaurant's unwelcoming attitude toward diners who didn't seem to belong to their usual clientele. One review in particular caught my attention. A woman named Sarah had written about taking her elderly mother to Romano's for a birthday celebration, only to feel judged and rushed throughout the meal. She described her mother's excitement about trying new dishes being met with subtle condescension from the staff, and noted that nearby tables seemed to be receiving more attentive service. The more I read, the more I realized that my experience wasn't unique. Romano's, and places like it, had created an environment where certain types of people were welcome and others were merely tolerated. The rules weren't posted anywhere, but they were enforced through subtle social pressure and the kind of judgment I'd felt from my own family. That weekend, I did something I'd never done before. I made a reservation at Romano's for one. I told myself I was conducting an experiment, trying to understand whether my family's embarrassment was justified or whether there was something deeper at play. Saturday evening found me sitting alone at a small table near the kitchen, the kind of spot they typically reserved for solo diners who weren't expected to order much or stay long. I dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that Isabella had previously approved, and I prepared a mental script to avoid the behaviors my family had found so mortifying. The experience was enlightening in the worst possible way. From the moment I was seated, I could feel the difference in how I was treated compared to the couples and groups around me. My server, a different young man from the week before, was polite but perfunctory, clearly eager to take my order and move on to more promising tables. When I ordered modestly, choosing a simple pasta dish and declining wine, I noticed how quickly he moved away from my table compared to the lengthy discussions he had with other guests about specials and wine pairings. When my food arrived and I ate quietly, speaking only when spoken to, I realized that my family's criticism had turned me into exactly what they wanted: invisible. But invisibility came with its own revelations. From my corner table, I could observe the restaurant's dynamics without being the center of attention. I watched as certain guests were greeted by name, offered complimentary appetizers, and engaged in warm conversations by the staff. I noticed how other diners, particularly older women dining alone or families who seemed less familiar with fine dining etiquette, were treated with the same subtle dismissiveness I'd experienced. The restaurant had a hierarchy, and I was definitely near the bottom of it, regardless of my ability to pay for the meal. It wasn't about money, it was about belonging to the right social class, knowing the right codes, and most importantly, not asking too many questions or showing too much enthusiasm for the experience. As I sat there picking at my pasta, I made a decision that would change everything. I pulled out my phone and began researching Castellano Restaurant Group more thoroughly than I ever had any potential client. By the time I finished my meal and paid the check, I had a basic understanding of their financial structure, their expansion plans, and, most importantly, their vulnerabilities. The next week passed in a blur of research and planning. I contacted business brokers, reviewed financial statements, and reached out to industry connections I'd made through my accounting practice. What I discovered was that Castellano Restaurant Group, despite their reputation and prime locations, was struggling financially. The restaurant industry had been hit hard by various economic pressures, and their focus on maintaining an exclusive atmosphere had limited their customer base just as dining habits were changing. They were profitable, but barely, and they were carrying significant debt from a recent expansion that hadn't performed as expected. More importantly, I learned that the Castellano family was looking for an exit strategy. The patriarch was aging, his children weren't interested in the restaurant business, and they were quietly exploring options for selling the company. It was the kind of opportunity that came along once in a lifetime, and I was in the unique position to take advantage of it. By Friday of that week, I had assembled a team of lawyers and financial advisors and made an initial approach to Castellano Restaurant Group about acquiring their assets. My offer was generous enough to get their immediate attention, but structured in a way that would give me maximum control over the transition. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using skills I'd developed through decades of building my accounting practice, the same work ethic and business acumen that my family seemed to think made me unsuitable for fine dining, to potentially become the owner of the very establishment where they were embarrassed to be seen with me. The preliminary negotiations were surprisingly smooth. The Castellano family was more eager to sell than I had expected, and my financial backing was solid enough to make the deal attractive to them.
Within 2 weeks, we had the framework of an agreement that would make me the majority owner of 4 upscale restaurants, including Romano's Italian Bistro. But ownership was only the first step in my plan. What I really wanted was the power to change the culture that had made me feel so unwelcome, and more importantly, to show my family that their judgment said more about them than it did about me. During the due diligence period, I spent countless hours at each restaurant observing operations and getting to know the staff. What I found was both predictable and disappointing. The culture of exclusivity that my family had bought into was deliberately cultivated by management and reinforced by servers who were trained to make certain customers feel special while making others feel tolerated. There were unofficial guidelines about how to handle different types of diners, with clear preferences given to regular customers, business diners, and anyone who appeared to be part of the local social elite. Questions about the menu were discouraged, special requests were met with subtle resistance, and enthusiasm about the food was seen as unsophisticated. But I also discovered something else. Many of the staff members were uncomfortable with these policies. Several servers mentioned feeling bad about treating certain customers differently, and the kitchen staff was frustrated by the restrictions on accommodating dietary preferences and special requests. The more I learned about the business, the more I realized that the culture of exclusivity wasn't just morally problematic, it was also economically limiting. By alienating potential customers who didn't fit their narrow definition of appropriate clientele, they were missing out on significant revenue opportunities. My plans for the restaurants began to take shape during those weeks of observation and analysis. I wasn't just going to own these establishments, I was going to transform them into places where people like me, people who were genuinely excited about good food and new experiences, would be welcome rather than merely tolerated. But first, I had a more personal matter to address. The closing date for the acquisition was set for the following month, and I decided it was time to test my family's commitment to avoiding embarrassment by association with me. I called Isabella and suggested another family dinner, this time to celebrate the completion of a major project for one of my biggest clients. I specifically mentioned wanting to return to Romano's, since we'd had such a lovely time there before. Her response was everything I'd expected and dreaded. "Oh, Mom, Romano's is so formal," she said, her voice carefully neutral.
Why don't we try that new Tex-Mex place everyone's talking about? It might be more relaxed and fun. Carmen's response was even more direct when I called her next. Elena, honey, I think you might enjoy Romano's more if you went with just 1 or 2 people instead of a big group. Sometimes these fancy places can feel overwhelming with too many personalities at the table. The message was clear. They were implementing their plan to steer me away from upscale restaurants to protect themselves from embarrassment. What they didn't know was that I had already heard their strategy discussed in that bathroom stall, and I was about to turn their world upside down. Instead of arguing or trying to convince them, I simply agreed to their suggestions and made a reservation at the Tex-Mex restaurant Isabella had mentioned. But I also made another reservation, one that would set the stage for the most satisfying confrontation of my life. The family dinner at the casual restaurant was exactly what I had expected. Pleasant, safe, and completely forgettable. My questions about the ingredients in the salsa were met with smiles instead of eye rolls. My enthusiasm for the atmosphere was seen as appropriate for the setting, and my habit of complimenting the staff was welcomed rather than endured. But as I watched my family relax and enjoy themselves, I couldn't help feeling sad about what we'd all lost. This could have been our dynamic at Romano's too, if they'd chosen to see my curiosity and enthusiasm as positive traits rather than sources of embarrassment. After dinner, as we were saying goodbye in the parking lot, I made an announcement that caught everyone off guard. "I've been thinking about our last dinner at Romano's," I said, watching their faces carefully. I realized I might have been a bit overwhelming that night, asking too many questions and maybe not following the usual etiquette. Carmen and Isabella exchanged quick glances, clearly uncertain about where this conversation was heading. "Mom,
You weren't overwhelming, Isabella said, though her voice lacked conviction. You were just being yourself. Well, I'd like to have a chance to do better, I continued. I've made reservations for all of us at Romano's next Friday night. I want to show you that I can navigate a fancy restaurant properly when I put my mind to it. The silence that followed was deafening. Miguel looked confused, clearly unaware of the undercurrents in the conversation. James seemed uncomfortable, probably remembering his colleagues seeing my previous performance. Carmen and Isabella both looked like they were trying to find polite ways to decline. Elena, Carmen finally said, you don't need to prove anything to us. We love you exactly as you are. It was a beautiful lie, delivered with such sincerity that I almost believed she meant it. But I had heard her real thoughts in that bathroom, and I knew exactly how conditional that love really was. I insist, I said firmly. Consider it my treat and my chance to show you that I've been paying attention to your feedback. Reluctantly, they all agreed to the dinner, though I could see them already dreading the experience. What they didn't know was that by Friday night, I would be in a very different position than they anticipated. The closing on Castellano Restaurant Group took place on Thursday morning, exactly one day before our family dinner. As I signed the final papers and received the keys to 4 restaurants worth several $1,000,000, I felt a surge of power and satisfaction unlike anything I'd experienced in my business career. I was no longer Elena Vasquez, the embarrassing family member who didn't know how to behave in nice restaurants. I was Elena Vasquez, owner and CEO of some of the most prestigious dining establishments in the city. And tomorrow night, my family was going to discover just how dramatically the power dynamic had shifted. Friday evening couldn't come fast enough. I spent that Friday afternoon preparing for the evening in ways my family could never have imagined. While they were probably dreading another night of my supposed social blunders, I was meeting with Marcus Rodriguez, the general manager of Romano's, to discuss immediate changes to restaurant policy and staff training. Marcus was a seasoned professional who had worked in high-end hospitality for over 15 years, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes as we sat in his office behind the kitchen. He'd been told that morning about the ownership change, and he was clearly trying to figure out what kind of boss I was going to be. Mrs. Vasquez, I want you to know that we've always prided ourselves on maintaining the highest standards of service and atmosphere. Our regular customers have come to expect a certain level of sophistication. I leaned back in the leather chair across from his desk, studying this man who probably had witnessed my family's embarrassment firsthand just weeks earlier. He had no idea that I'd been that woman asking too many questions about the osso buco, the one whose enthusiasm had made her daughter put her head in her hands. Tell me about those standards, Marcus. What exactly does sophistication mean to you and your staff? He shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing that this wasn't a casual question. Well, we maintain a refined atmosphere by ensuring that all interactions meet the expectations of discerning diners. Our staff is trained to provide knowledgeable service while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Appropriate boundaries, I repeated. Can you give me some examples of what that looks like in practice? Marcus glanced toward the door as if hoping someone might interrupt this conversation. For instance, we don't encourage lengthy discussions about menu items that might slow down service for other tables. We guide customers towards selections that match the restaurant standards, and we maintain a professional distance that preserves the dining experience. Every word he spoke confirmed what I'd suspected about the culture of this place. They had systematically created an environment where curiosity was discouraged, questions were unwelcome, and certain types of customers were made to feel intrusive simply for engaging with the experience they were paying for.
Marcus, starting immediately, I want you to implement some changes, I said, pulling out a folder I'd prepared. First, I want every staff member to understand that customer questions about ingredients, preparation methods, and menu items are not inconveniences to be managed, but opportunities to enhance the dining experience. His eyebrows rose slightly. Of course, Mrs. Vasquez, we've always encouraged our staff to be helpful. Have you? I asked pointedly, because my understanding is that servers have been trained to subtly discourage extensive menu discussions and to make customers feel awkward for requesting modifications or expressing enthusiasm about their meals. The color drained from his face, and I knew I'd hit the mark. He was beginning to realize that I wasn't just any new owner making random demands. I had inside knowledge of exactly how this restaurant operated. "I'm not sure who gave you that impression," he said carefully, "but I can assure you that we treat all customers with respect." I opened my folder and pulled out printed copies of online reviews I'd compiled, highlighting specific complaints about feeling rushed, judged, or unwelcome. "These are from the past 6 months, Marcus. 14 separate reviews mentioning feeling intimidated by staff attitudes, being made to feel like they didn't belong, or being treated dismissively when they asked questions about the menu." He scanned the papers, his expression growing more concerned with each page. These weren't isolated incidents or unreasonable complainers. They were a clear pattern of customer dissatisfaction with the very culture he'd just defended. "Starting Monday," I continued, "I want you to schedule mandatory training sessions for all front-of-house staff. The focus will be on genuine hospitality, encouraging customer engagement, and creating an atmosphere where every diner feels welcome, regardless of their familiarity with fine dining etiquette." "Mrs. Vasquez," Marcus said slowly, "I understand your concern about customer satisfaction, but we need to consider the expectations of our established clientele. They've chosen Romano's partly because of the refined atmosphere we maintain." "And what happens when those established clients age out or move away?" I asked. "What's your plan for attracting new customers if you continue to alienate anyone who doesn't already know your unwritten rules?" He had no answer for that, which wasn't surprising. The restaurant industry was changing rapidly, and places that clung to outdated notions of exclusivity were finding themselves struggling to remain relevant. Romano's financial difficulties were proof of that reality. "Let me be very clear about something," I said, my voice taking on the authority I'd developed through decades of running my own business. "This restaurant will maintain its standards of food quality and service excellence, but it will no longer maintain standards that make paying customers feel unwelcome for showing interest in their dining experience." I handed him a detailed list I'd prepared of specific policy changes I wanted implemented immediately. Servers were to be encouraged to engage with customer questions, special dietary requests were to be accommodated whenever possible, and any staff member caught making customers feel judged or unwelcome would face disciplinary action. "I also want you to review the seating policies," I added. "I've noticed that certain customers are consistently given less desirable tables, particularly older women dining alone and families who appear to be celebrating special occasions but might not be regular diners." His jaw tightened slightly. "Our seating assignments are based on reservation times and table availability." "Are they?" I pulled out another document from my folder because I've had researchers make reservations under different names and personas over the past 2 weeks. The results show a clear pattern of preferential seating based on perceived social status rather than reservation times or party size. The evidence was overwhelming, and we both knew it. I'd approached this acquisition with the same thoroughness I brought to auditing corporate clients, and I'd found exactly what I'd expected to find: systematic discrimination disguised as maintaining standards. "Mrs. Vasquez," Marcus said, finally, "I hope you understand that these changes might be challenging for some of our current staff to implement. They've been trained in certain approaches that they believe represent professional service." "Then we'll retrain them," I said simply, "and if any staff members find it impossible to treat all customers with genuine warmth and respect, we'll help them find positions elsewhere that better suit their attitudes." I could see him processing the implications of what I was saying. This wasn't just about policy changes or customer service improvements. This was about completely transforming the culture of the restaurant, and some people weren't going to adjust well to that transformation. "There's something else I need you to understand," I said, standing up from my chair. "Tonight, I'll be dining here with my family. They have no idea that I now own this restaurant. I want you to ensure that we receive the same quality of service that any other customers would receive, based on the new standards we've just discussed." His eyes widened as he realized the significance of what I was telling him.
Mrs. Vasquez, are you saying that you've dined here before as a customer? Multiple times, I confirmed, and I'm very familiar with how certain types of diners are typically treated in this establishment. Tonight will be a test of whether your staff can begin implementing the changes we've discussed. I could see him connecting the dots.
probably remembering instances where he'd witnessed customers being treated with the subtle condescension I was now in a position to eliminate. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and he was smart enough to understand the implications. Of course, he said quickly. I'll brief the staff immediately about providing exceptional service to all guests this evening. Don't brief them specifically about my party, I said firmly. I want to see how they treat us based on the general policy changes, not because they know who's paying their salaries. After leaving Romano's, I drove home to prepare for the evening with a sense of anticipation I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in decades, I was going to walk into that restaurant as someone with real power, even if my family had no idea how dramatically things had changed. I chose my outfit carefully, the same black dress I'd worn to our disastrous dinner weeks earlier. But tonight, I wouldn't be the woman whose daughter put her head in her hands with embarrassment. Tonight, I would be the owner of the establishment, testing whether my staff could live up to the standards I'd just established. The drive to meet my family at the restaurant gave me time to reflect on how surreal this situation had become. Just a month ago, I'd been crying in a bathroom stall, devastated by the realization that my loved ones were ashamed of me. Now I was about to demonstrate that their shame said more about their values than it did about my behavior. I arrived at Romano's 10 minutes before our reservation time, partly to observe the arrival process, and partly because I wanted to see my family's reactions when they realized I was already there. The hostess, a young woman named Angela, whom I'd met during my ownership transition meetings, greeted me with professional warmth. "Good evening, Mrs. Vasquez," she said, then caught herself. We'd discussed how important it was that staff not treat me differently from other guests, especially when I was dining with people who didn't know about the ownership change. "I mean, good evening. Your party will be seated as soon as everyone arrives." I nodded approvingly. She'd almost made the mistake of acknowledging our special relationship, but she'd recovered well. "Thank you. I'll wait for the others." From my position near the entrance, I could see the subtle changes that had already begun to take place. The hostess station had been repositioned to be more welcoming, and I noticed that the staff seemed more engaged with arriving guests, offering genuine smiles rather than the professional but distant greetings I'd observed before. Carmen and Roberto arrived first, looking elegant and confident as they always did in upscale establishments. Carmen was wearing a burgundy dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and Roberto looked distinguished in his perfectly tailored suit. They belonged in this world in ways I'd always envied. "Elena," Carmen said, embracing me with what seemed like genuine warmth. "You look lovely tonight. I'm so glad you suggested this." The lie rolled off her tongue so smoothly that I almost admired her skill. She was absolutely dreading this evening, but she was performing the role of supportive sister with Oscar-worthy conviction. Isabella and James arrived next, followed closely by Miguel and his girlfriend Sophia, whom I'd grown quite fond of over the past year. As we gathered in the waiting area, I could feel the familiar tension building. They were all preparing themselves for another evening of managing my social inadequacies. "Should we let them know we're all here?" Isabella asked, glancing toward the hostess station with the efficient manner she used at work. "I already did," I said simply, watching as Angela approached our group with menus and a warm smile. "The Vasquez party? Right this way, please. We have a beautiful table ready for you." As we followed her into the dining room, I paid close attention to where we were being seated. Instead of the corner table near the kitchen where they'd placed me during my solo dinner, or the adequate but unremarkable spot we'd occupied during our previous family meal, Angela led us to a prime table near the windows with an excellent view of the restaurant's interior. Carmen raised an eyebrow as we were seated. "This is a much better table than usual," she murmured to Roberto, who nodded in agreement. The seating assignment wasn't because they knew I was the owner. It was because Angela was following the new policy I had established: give customers the best available table regardless of their perceived social status. My family was experiencing the kind of treatment they'd always assumed they deserved, but had rarely actually received. Our server approached the table within minutes, a young man named Christopher, whom I'd also met during my transition meetings. He was one of the staff members who had expressed discomfort with the previous policies, and I was curious to see how he'd implement the new approach. "Good evening, everyone," he said with genuine enthusiasm. "Welcome to Romano's."
I'm Christopher, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start by telling you about some of our specials, or would you prefer to hear about our wine selection first?
The immediate difference in his approach was remarkable. Instead of the perfunctory greeting and rushed pace I'd experienced before, Christopher seemed genuinely pleased to be serving our table. He made eye contact with each person as he spoke, and his body language conveyed interest rather than the barely concealed impatience I'd witnessed previously. "We'd love to hear about the specials," I said, watching my family's faces carefully. They all looked pleasantly surprised by Christopher's warm demeanor. "Excellent," he said, pulling out a small notebook. "Tonight our chef has prepared a pan-seared halibut with a lemon herb risotto that's absolutely exceptional. The fish is from the Gulf, delivered this morning, and the risotto is made with a wine reduction that really complements the delicate flavor of the halibut." He continued describing each special with genuine enthusiasm, providing details about ingredients and preparation methods without making anyone feel like they were receiving a lecture. When he finished, instead of rushing away to take orders, he paused and asked if anyone had questions about the menu or dietary restrictions he should know about. Miguel looked impressed. "The halibut sounds wonderful. Is the risotto very rich? I'm trying to eat lighter these days." "It's definitely indulgent," Christopher admitted with a smile, "but our chef can prepare it with less cream and butter if you'd prefer. We can also substitute a grilled vegetable medley that pairs beautifully with the halibut if you'd like something lighter." I watched Isabella's face as she processed this interaction. Christopher had not only answered Miguel's question thoroughly, but had offered alternatives without making my son feel like he was asking for special treatment. This was exactly the kind of service I'd envisioned when I'd outlined the policy changes. "That's very helpful," Miguel said. "I think I'll try the lighter version of the risotto." "Perfect choice," Christopher replied. "And please don't hesitate to let me know if you'd like any modifications to other dishes as well. Our kitchen is very accommodating." As he moved around the table taking orders, I decided to test the new policies more directly. When he reached me, I asked about the ingredients in several different dishes, requested information about wine pairings, and even asked if the kitchen could prepare a custom pasta dish combining elements from 2 different menu items. Instead of the subtle resistance and barely concealed irritation I'd experienced before, Christopher responded to each question with patience and enthusiasm. He offered detailed explanations, suggested alternatives, and even went to check with the kitchen about the custom pasta preparation. "The chef says he'd be delighted to create that combination for you," he reported when he returned. "He's actually excited to try something new, and he thinks the flavors will work beautifully together." The transformation was so dramatic that I could see my family exchanging glances of surprise and confusion. They'd expected another evening of cringing at my inappropriate questions and requests, but instead, they were witnessing the kind of attentive, accommodating service that made dining at upscale restaurants genuinely pleasurable. Carmen leaned over as Christopher headed to the kitchen with our orders. "This is certainly different from last time," she said quietly. "The service seems much more welcoming. Maybe they've implemented some new training." Isabella mentioned that a lot of restaurants are focusing more on customer experience these days. I nodded thoughtfully. It does seem like they're putting more emphasis on making sure customers feel comfortable asking questions and making requests. What they didn't know was that this was exactly what I'd spent the afternoon arranging. Every positive interaction they were experiencing was the result of policies I'd personally implemented just hours earlier. Throughout the meal, I continued to engage with Christopher in ways that had previously made my family uncomfortable. I asked follow-up questions about the wine he'd recommended, complimented the presentation of each dish, and requested modifications to my custom pasta when it arrived looking slightly different than I'd expected. But instead of eye rolls and embarrassed glances, my family began participating in the conversations with Christopher. Isabella asked about the restaurant's wine selection process, Miguel inquired about the sourcing of their seafood, and even Carmen engaged in a lengthy discussion about the chef's background and training. The evening was becoming everything I dreamed our restaurant experiences could be: engaging, educational, and genuinely enjoyable for everyone involved. My family was discovering the pleasure of interactive dining, the joy of learning about food and wine, and the satisfaction of receiving service that encouraged rather than discouraged their curiosity. This has been exceptional, Sophia said, as we finished our main courses. I feel like I've learned so much about Italian cuisine tonight. Christopher has been wonderful, Isabella agreed. It's so refreshing to have a server who seems genuinely interested in making sure we have a great experience. I smiled, knowing that Christopher's enthusiasm wasn't just professional courtesy. It was the result of working in an environment where he was encouraged to engage with customers rather than rush them through their meals. The policy changes I'd implemented weren't just benefiting customers like me, they were allowing staff members to take pride in their work in ways they hadn't been able to before. As we waited for dessert, Miguel raised his wine glass in a toast. "To Mom," he said, "for bringing us all together for another wonderful family dinner."
The irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. They were toasting me for providing exactly the kind of dining experience they'd previously found embarrassing, not realizing that their enjoyment was possible only because I'd eliminated the barriers that had made their previous judgment seem reasonable. "This really has been special," Carmen added. "I have to admit, Alina, you seem much more comfortable in this setting than you were before." She meant it as a compliment, but it revealed so much about how they'd perceived my previous behavior. They thought I'd somehow learned to be more appropriate, more sophisticated, more worthy of dining in establishments like Romano's. They had no idea that the restaurant had changed to accommodate people like me, rather than the other way around. "I think I'm just more relaxed when I feel welcome," I said carefully, testing how they'd respond to this subtle hint about the real dynamics at play. "That makes sense," Isabella said thoughtfully. "There's definitely something different about the atmosphere here tonight. It feels more inclusive, I suppose." Inclusive. The word hung in the air as I processed what my daughter had just said. She'd identified exactly what had changed, the very quality that had been missing from Romano's before I took ownership. The restaurant was finally living up to its potential as a place where people could enjoy exceptional food and service without feeling judged or unwelcome. When Christopher returned with the dessert menu, I made a decision that would test both the new policies and my family's evolving attitudes. "Could we possibly get a tour of the kitchen?" I asked. "I'm fascinated by restaurant operations, and I'd love to meet the chef who created such amazing food tonight." The request was exactly the kind of thing that would have mortified my family during our previous visit. It was presumptuous, it showed too much interest in behind-the-scenes operations, and it demonstrated the kind of enthusiasm that they'd found so embarrassing. But Christopher's face lit up with genuine excitement. "I'd love to arrange that," he said. "Let me check with Chef Martinez to see if this would be a good time." He returned within minutes with the chef himself, a distinguished man in his 50s who seemed genuinely pleased to meet our table. "I understand you'd like to see the kitchen," he said warmly. "I'd be honored to show you around, especially since you ordered that custom pasta dish. It turned out even better than I hoped." The next 20 minutes were magical. Chef Martinez led us through the spotless kitchen, explaining techniques, introducing us to other staff members, and answering every question we had about food preparation, ingredient sourcing, and menu development. He was clearly passionate about his work, and his enthusiasm was infectious. My family was completely engaged, asking thoughtful questions and expressing genuine appreciation for the complexity of restaurant operations. Isabella took photos of the impressive plating station, Miguel discussed the nutritional aspects of various cooking methods, and even Carmen seemed fascinated by the wine storage and selection process. "This has been incredible," Isabella said as we concluded the tour. "I had no idea how much skill and coordination goes into every dish. Most customers never get to see behind the scenes like this. It's refreshing to serve people who are genuinely interested in the culinary process." As we returned to our table for dessert and coffee, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in my family's understanding of what it meant to engage with fine dining. They discovered that curiosity and enthusiasm weren't embarrassing traits to be managed. They were qualities that enhanced the entire experience when they were welcome, rather than discouraged. "Mom," Miguel said as we lingered over our desserts, "I have to apologize for something. I think I've been too focused on dining etiquette and not enough on actually enjoying these experiences. Tonight reminded me why we started doing these family dinners in the first place." Carmen nodded in agreement.
You've always been more willing to engage with new experiences than the rest of us. Maybe we've been too worried about appearances instead of focusing on what really matters. Their words were validation I'd never expected to receive. They were beginning to understand that my behavior hadn't been inappropriate. Their judgment of it had been misguided. The problem hadn't been my enthusiasm for food and dining. The problem had been an environment that discouraged engagement and curiosity. But they still didn't know the full truth about why this evening had been so different from our previous experiences. They had no idea that their newfound appreciation for interactive dining was possible only because I'd used my wealth and business acumen to eliminate the barriers that had made them ashamed of me. As we prepared to leave, Christopher approached our table one final time. "I hope you've enjoyed your evening," he said. "It's been a pleasure serving such an engaged and appreciative table." "It's been wonderful," I replied, pulling out my credit card to pay the check. This is exactly the kind of dining experience that makes special occasions memorable.
Christopher processed the payment with the same warm efficiency he'd shown throughout the evening, and I left a generous tip that reflected both the exceptional service and my satisfaction with how well the staff had implemented the new policies. As we walked toward the parking lot, my family continued to discuss the evening with an enthusiasm I'd rarely heard from them about restaurant experiences. They were planning return visits, talking about bringing friends to Romano's, and even discussing other restaurants they wanted to try with their newfound appreciation for interactive dining. "Elena," Carmen said as we reached our cars, "thank you for suggesting we come back here. I think we all learned something important tonight." "What's that?" I asked, though I suspected I knew what she was going to say. "That the best dining experiences happen when you're genuinely engaged with the food, the service, and each other. We've been too focused on following rules instead of enjoying the experience." It was exactly the realization I'd hoped they would reach, but they'd arrived at it without knowing that I'd orchestrated the entire transformation. They thought they'd simply had a better server and a more welcoming atmosphere by coincidence. They had no idea that every positive interaction had been the result of policies I'd personally implemented to address the discrimination I'd experienced as a customer. The drive home gave me time to process the success of the evening and to plan the next phase of my strategy. The new policies were clearly working, and my staff was capable of providing the kind of service that made all customers feel welcome. But I still hadn't revealed my ownership to my family, and I was beginning to think about how and when to make that disclosure. More importantly, I was starting to understand that my plan for revenge was evolving into something more constructive. Instead of simply proving that I could ban my family from the restaurants where they'd been embarrassed by me, I was demonstrating that their embarrassment had been based on artificial barriers that served no one well. The real victory wasn't going to be excluding them from Romano's. It was going to be showing them that their values had been misguided and that my approach to dining had been right all along. But I wanted to test their commitment to these new realizations before I revealed the truth about why this evening had been so different. Over the next few days, I monitored the restaurant's operations carefully, visiting during different shifts and observing how the staff was implementing the policy changes with other customers. The transformation was remarkable and consistent. Reviews began improving almost immediately, with multiple customers commenting on the welcoming atmosphere and attentive service. But I also discovered something unexpected during my observations. Several of the restaurant's longtime regular customers were complaining about the changes. They missed the exclusivity, the sense of being part of a select group that received special treatment, while others were merely tolerated. Marcus brought me a stack of feedback forms during our weekly meeting, his expression troubled. "Mrs. Vasquez, we're getting some pushback from established customers who feel that the service has become too accommodating. They're saying the restaurant is losing its refined atmosphere." I reviewed the complaints, recognizing the familiar language of people who defined their status by their ability to exclude others. These customers had enjoyed feeling superior to diners like me, and they were uncomfortable with policies that treated all paying customers equally. "How many of these complaints have we received?" I asked. "About 15 over the past 2 weeks, but we've also received over 40 positive reviews from new customers who appreciate the welcoming service." "And which group represents more revenue potential?"
I asked, though I already knew the answer. Marcus consulted his reports. The new customers are ordering more appetizers, trying more wine selections, and staying longer. Their average check is actually higher than our traditional regulars, and they're making repeat reservations more frequently. The business case was clear, but I wanted to make sure Marcus understood the broader implications of what we were accomplishing. This isn't just about revenue, Marcus. We're creating an environment where people can enjoy exceptional food and service without feeling like they need to prove they belong here. He nodded slowly. I have to admit, Mrs. Vasquez, the staff seems happier with the new policies. They feel more comfortable engaging with customers, and they're taking more pride in their work. That's because hospitality is supposed to be about making people feel welcome. When you create artificial barriers and encourage staff to judge customers, you're working against the fundamental purpose of the restaurant industry. Over the following weeks, I continued to dine at Romano's regularly, sometimes alone and sometimes with various groups, testing different aspects of the service and observing customer reactions. The improvements were consistent and significant, but I was most pleased by the changes I observed in the staff. Servers who had previously seemed bored or dismissive were now engaging enthusiastically with their tables. The kitchen staff took more pride in accommodating special requests, and even the support staff seemed more invested in creating positive experiences for all customers. The transformation wasn't limited to Romano's either. I implemented similar policy changes at the other 3 restaurants I'd acquired, and the results were consistently positive. Word began to spread through the local dining scene that Castellano Restaurant Group had undergone a remarkable transformation under new ownership. Food critics who had previously written lukewarm reviews of the restaurants began publishing glowing assessments of the improved service and welcoming atmosphere. Local dining websites featured articles about the chain's commitment to inclusive hospitality, and reservation requests increased significantly across all locations. But the most satisfying feedback came from customers who reached out directly to share their experiences. I received emails from elderly diners who felt comfortable asking questions about menu items, from families celebrating special occasions who appreciated the staff's enthusiasm for their celebrations, and from food enthusiasts who enjoyed the educational aspects of their dining experiences. Each positive review and customer testimonial validated my belief that the changes I had implemented weren't just good business practices. They were morally necessary corrections to a system that had excluded people like me for arbitrary reasons.
3 weeks after our family dinner, I decided it was time for the next phase of my plan. I called Isabella and suggested another family gathering, this time to celebrate the success of a major business deal I'd recently completed. She agreed enthusiastically, mentioning how much everyone had enjoyed our last visit to Romano's. "The service there has really impressed me," she said during our phone conversation. "I've actually recommended it to several colleagues, and they've all had wonderful experiences." Perfect. My family had not only overcome their embarrassment about dining with me, they were now actively promoting the restaurant where they'd once found my behavior mortifying. They had no idea they were recommending an establishment that reflected my values rather than the exclusionary culture they'd previously preferred. I made the reservation for the following Friday, but this time I had a different kind of evening planned. It was time to reveal the truth about who owned Romano's and why our recent dining experiences had been so different from our earlier visits. The revelation I was planning would test everything my family thought they'd learned about dining, hospitality, and the true meaning of sophistication. More importantly, it would force them to confront the reality that their previous judgment of my behavior had been fundamentally wrong. As Friday approached, I found myself both excited and nervous about the conversation I was planning to have. This wasn't just about restaurant ownership or business success. It was about family relationships, personal values, and the courage to challenge systems that exclude people for the wrong reasons. The evening would mark the culmination of a transformation that had begun in a bathroom stall with overheard criticism and evolved into a comprehensive business acquisition and culture change initiative. But more than that, it would be the moment when my family would have to decide whether they truly supported the inclusive values they'd been praising or whether their appreciation was conditional on not knowing who was responsible for creating the welcoming environment they now enjoyed. Either way, I was ready for their reaction. I had spent months proving that my approach to dining and hospitality was not only valid, but profitable and sustainable. I had demonstrated that curiosity, enthusiasm, and genuine engagement enhance rather than diminish the fine dining experience. And I had shown that creating welcoming environments for all customers was both morally right and economically sound. Now it was time to claim credit for the transformation and to challenge my family to examine their own values and assumptions about what it truly meant to belong in spaces like Romano's Italian Bistro. The week leading up to our next family dinner felt like the longest of my life. Every day brought new evidence of the restaurant's transformation, from glowing online reviews to increased reservation requests. But I found myself increasingly anxious about revealing the truth to my family. This wasn't just about proving a point anymore. It was about fundamentally changing how they saw me and everything they thought they knew about social dynamics in fine dining. I spent Tuesday morning at Romano's conducting what I privately called my final inspection before the revelation dinner. Walking through the dining room at 11 in the morning, I watched the lunch prep unfold with a sense of pride that surprised me. The staff moved with purpose and energy that hadn't been present during my early visits as a customer. More importantly, I could see genuine enthusiasm in their interactions with the few early lunch guests who had already been seated. At table 12, a server named Maria was patiently explaining the difference between 3 pasta preparations to an elderly couple who seemed unfamiliar with Italian cuisine. Instead of the barely concealed impatience I'd witnessed months earlier, Maria's body language conveyed genuine interest in helping them find dishes they'd enjoy. When the woman asked if the marinara sauce was very spicy, Maria offered to bring a small sample so she could taste it before deciding. 2 tables over, another server was engaging enthusiastically with a businessman who was celebrating a promotion with a solo lunch. Rather than rushing him through his meal or making him feel awkward about dining alone, the server was treating him like a valued guest, making wine recommendations and suggesting dessert pairings that would enhance the celebration. These interactions weren't happening because the staff knew I was watching. They were happening because the culture I'd implemented had become genuine. The servers had discovered that treating customers with authentic warmth and interest made their jobs more enjoyable and resulted in better tips and more positive feedback.
Marcus found me observing from the bar area and approached with his daily operations report. Mrs. Vasquez, I wanted to update you on our weekend numbers. We're seeing a 35% increase in repeat customers compared to the same period last year, and our average table turnover time has actually improved despite the increased level of service interaction. How is that possible? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. When customers feel welcome and engaged, they're more decisive about their orders and more satisfied with their choices, he explained. They're not second-guessing their selections or feeling rushed, so the overall dining experience flows more smoothly. It was exactly what I'd hoped would happen. The changes I'd implemented weren't just making the restaurant more inclusive, they were making it more efficient and profitable. The staff was happier, the customers were more satisfied, and the business metrics were improving across the board. There's something else I want to discuss with you, I said, leading Marcus toward his office. This Friday evening, I'll be dining here with my family again, but this time I'm planning to reveal that I own the restaurant. His eyebrows rose significantly. May I ask why you've waited until now to tell them? Because I wanted to see if their attitudes about dining and hospitality would change based on experiencing better service, or if their embarrassment about my behavior was really about deeper issues with my social class and background. Marcus nodded slowly, clearly understanding the implications. And what have you concluded? That their previous embarrassment was based on a system designed to make people like me feel unwelcome, I said. They've embraced the changes we've made here because they've experienced how much better dining can be when curiosity and enthusiasm are welcomed rather than discouraged. How do you think they'll react when they learn you're responsible for those changes?
It was the question I'd been asking myself all week. Would they be proud of my business acumen and commitment to improving customer experience? Would they be embarrassed that I'd gone to such lengths to prove a point?
Would they understand that this was never really about revenge and always about creating spaces where people could enjoy fine dining without feeling judged? I honestly don't know, I admitted, but I think it's time to find out. I spent Wednesday and Thursday making final preparations for the Revelation dinner. I arranged for a private dining room at Romano's, ostensibly to celebrate the completion of a major business acquisition. I prepared a folder with documentation of the restaurant purchase, financial projections showing the improvements in customer satisfaction and profitability, and copies of the new training materials I'd implemented for staff. But most importantly, I prepared myself emotionally for whatever their reactions might be. This conversation would either strengthen our family relationships by helping them understand my perspective, or it would reveal fundamental differences in our values that couldn't be bridged by shared meals and polite conversation. Friday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth for December, and I chose to wear a burgundy dress that Isabella had always complimented. If I was going to reveal the extent of my business success and the depth of their misunderstanding about my social appropriateness, I wanted to look the part of a successful entrepreneur rather than the embarrassing family member they'd been managing. I arrived at Romano's 30 minutes before our reservation time, using the back entrance that led directly to the private dining room I'd reserved. The space was elegant but intimate, with seating for 8 around a polished mahogany table and windows overlooking the restaurant's herb garden. I'd specifically chosen this room because it would allow us to have a private conversation while still being part of the restaurant atmosphere. Marcus met me in the private dining room to review the evening's service plan. Christopher will be your primary server again, and Chef Martinez has prepared a special tasting menu that showcases some of our most popular dishes from the past few months. Perfect, I said, arranging the documents I'd brought in a neat stack on the credenza behind my chair. And Marcus, after I reveal the ownership information, please give my family a few minutes to process before you join us. I'd like them to be able to ask me questions privately first. Of course, Mrs. Vasquez. And may I say, this has been the most rewarding professional experience I've had in years. What you've accomplished here goes far beyond business success. His words meant more to me than I'd expected. Marcus had been part of the old system, and seeing him embrace the changes with genuine enthusiasm validated my belief that most people wanted to provide excellent hospitality when they were encouraged to do so. My family began arriving at 7 o'clock, and I greeted each of them in the main dining room before leading them to our private space. They seemed impressed by the special arrangement, and I could see them wondering what business success I was celebrating that warranted such an elaborate dinner. "Mom, this is incredibly fancy," Isabella said as we settled into our seats. "What's the occasion? You mentioned a business deal, but you've been very mysterious about the details." "All will be revealed," I said, with what I hoped was an enigmatic smile. "But first, let's enjoy some wine and catch up." Carmen looked around the private dining room with obvious appreciation. "Elena, I have to say, your taste in restaurants has really improved lately. This place has become one of my favorites." "Mine too," Miguel added. "Sophia and I came back here last weekend for our anniversary, and the service was exceptional. I don't know what they've changed, but it's like dining at a completely different restaurant." The irony of their comments wasn't lost on me. They were praising my taste in restaurants while sitting in an establishment I owned, complimenting changes I had personally implemented, and crediting the transformation to mysterious improvements they couldn't identify. Christopher arrived with wine and began the evening with the same warm professionalism he'd shown during our previous visit. As he described the tasting menu Chef Martinez had prepared, I watched my family's faces and saw the genuine engagement that had replaced their previous anxiety about my dining behavior. "The first course is a selection of antipasti featuring local ingredients," Christopher explained. "Chef Martinez has included some items that aren't on our regular menu, preparations he's been experimenting with based on customer feedback and requests." Customer feedback and requests. The irony was delicious.
My own questions and suggestions during previous visits had likely influenced some of the dishes we'd be tasting tonight. As we began eating, the conversation flowed naturally around family news, work updates, and holiday plans. But I could sense an undercurrent of curiosity about why I'd arranged such an elaborate evening. They knew me well enough to realize that this wasn't just about celebrating a business deal. There was something more significant I wanted to discuss. Elena, Carmen said during the second course, I have to ask about this mysterious business acquisition you mentioned. You've been working on something major, haven't you? I have, I confirmed, setting down my fork and looking around the table at the faces of the people I loved most in the world. In fact, the acquisition is the reason we're having this conversation tonight. Isabella leaned forward with interest. What kind of business? Another accounting firm? Not exactly, I said, reaching behind my chair to retrieve the folder I'd prepared. 3 months ago, I purchased Castellano Restaurant Group, which owns 4 upscale establishments in the city.
Restaurant group? Miguel asked slowly. Mom, are you saying you bought restaurants? 4 restaurants, I corrected, including Romano's Italian Bistro, where we're dining tonight. Carmen's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips. You bought Romano's? I own Romano's, I said simply. I own this building. I employ the staff who have been serving us so wonderfully, and I'm responsible for the changes in service and atmosphere that you've all been praising. The expressions around the table ranged from shock to confusion to what might have been the beginning of understanding. Isabella was the first to find her voice. Mom, when did this happen? How did this happen? Why didn't you tell us? I finalized the purchase in November, I said, opening the folder to show them the acquisition documents. As for why I didn't tell you, I think you'll understand when I explain what led to this decision. I took a deep breath, knowing that the next part of the conversation would be the most difficult. Do you remember our family dinner here in October? The one where we were celebrating David's acceptance to medical school? They all nodded, though I could see some uncertainty in their expressions as they tried to recall the specific details of that evening. During that dinner, I excused myself to use the restroom, I continued. While I was there, I overheard a conversation between Carmen and Isabella about how embarrassed they were by my behavior in restaurants. The color drained from both of their faces. Carmen set her wine glass down with trembling hands, and Isabella looked like she might be sick. Mom, Isabella whispered, we never meant for you to hear that. But you meant every word of it, I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. You talked about how inappropriate my questions were, how embarrassing my enthusiasm was, and how you needed to find ways to avoid taking me to nice restaurants because my behavior reflected poorly on the family. Carmen buried her face in her hands. Elena, I'm so sorry. We were frustrated and we said things we shouldn't have said. Were you wrong, though? I asked. Were my questions inappropriate? Was my enthusiasm embarrassing? Did my behavior really reflect poorly on the family? The question hung in the air as they struggled to find an answer. They'd spent the past 2 months praising the very behaviors they'd previously found mortifying, but they'd done so without knowing I was responsible for creating an environment where those behaviors were welcomed. Mom, Miguel said quietly, I'm not sure I understand what you're trying to tell us. I pulled out copies of the training materials I'd implemented and the customer satisfaction surveys that documented the restaurant's transformation. What I'm telling you is that there was nothing wrong with my behavior in restaurants. The problem was that places like Romano's had created cultures that made curious, enthusiastic customers feel unwelcome. I spread the documents across the table so they could see the evidence of what I'd accomplished. When I bought this restaurant, I implemented new policies that encouraged staff to engage with customer questions, accommodate special requests, and create welcoming atmospheres for all diners, regardless of their familiarity with fine dining etiquette. Isabella picked up one of the training manuals, scanning the pages with growing understanding. These are the changes that made our recent visits so much more enjoyable. Exactly, I said.
The service you've been praising, the welcoming atmosphere you've been recommending to friends, the inclusive culture that made Miguel feel comfortable asking about lighter menu options. All of that exists because I used my business success to eliminate the barriers that made you ashamed of me. The weight of this revelation settled over the table like a heavy blanket. They were beginning to understand that their embarrassment hadn't been justified by my inappropriate behavior. It had been manufactured by systems designed to exclude people who didn't already belong to the right social class. Elena, Carmen said, her voice barely above a whisper, what we said in that restroom was cruel and wrong, but surely you understand that there are appropriate ways to behave in upscale restaurants. Are there? I asked, pulling out printed reviews from customers who dined at Romano's since the policy changes. Here's what happened when we eliminated those supposedly appropriate behaviors. I read them excerpts from dozens of reviews praising the staff's patience with questions, their enthusiasm for helping customers understand menu options, and their willingness to accommodate special requests. Customer satisfaction scores had increased by 40%, repeat business had grown by 35%, and average check sizes had improved by 20%. Mom, Isabella said, tears forming in her eyes, are you saying that your approach was right all along? I'm saying that curiosity and enthusiasm enhance the dining experience when they're welcomed rather than discouraged. I'm saying that restaurants serve their customers better when they focus on hospitality rather than exclusivity. And I'm saying that your embarrassment about my behavior was based on artificial barriers that served no one well. Miguel looked up from the financial reports I'd shared.
The business results are incredible. You've improved everything: customer satisfaction, staff morale, profitability. How did you know this would work? Because I understood something that the previous ownership didn't, I said. People who are excited about food and wine, people who ask questions and make special requests, people who compliment the staff and want to learn about cooking techniques. Those are the customers who spend more money, return more frequently, and generate positive word-of-mouth recommendations. James, who had been quiet throughout this revelation, finally spoke up. Elena, this is remarkable business achievement, but I have to ask, was this really about proving a business point, or was this about getting back at us for what we said? It was a fair question, and I'd been expecting it. Initially, I was hurt and angry about what I'd overheard. I wanted to prove that I could succeed in this industry and that your judgment of my behavior was wrong. But as I got deeper into the business, I realized this was about something much bigger than family dynamics. I gestured around the private dining room, toward the main restaurant beyond our windows. This became about creating spaces where people can enjoy exceptional food and service without worrying about whether they're sophisticated enough to belong there. It became about building businesses that succeed by including people rather than excluding them. Carmen wiped tears from her eyes. We were so wrong about everything. Your questions weren't inappropriate, they were engaged. Your enthusiasm wasn't embarrassing, it was joyful. Your behavior didn't reflect poorly on the family. Our judgment of it reflected poorly on our values. The acknowledgement I'd been hoping for was finally coming, but it didn't feel as satisfying as I'd expected. Instead, I felt sad about all the years we'd wasted on misguided ideas about social appropriateness and the months of distance that had developed between us based on their embarrassment. What happens now? Isabella asked. How do we move forward from this? That depends on what you've learned from this experience, I said. Are you willing to examine other situations where you might be judging people based on artificial social barriers? Are you prepared to recognize that enthusiasm and curiosity are positive qualities even when they don't conform to established etiquette? Sophia, who had been listening quietly throughout this conversation, spoke up for the first time. Mrs. Vasquez, what you've accomplished here is incredible. But more than that, you've helped all of us understand something important about hospitality and inclusion. What's that? I asked. That making people feel welcome isn't about enforcing rules, she said. It's about creating environments where people can be themselves without fear of judgment. Her insight was exactly what I'd hoped my family would understand.
The changes I'd implemented at Romano's weren't just good business practices, they were expressions of fundamental values about how people should treat each other in social spaces. Christopher appeared in the doorway of our private dining room, clearly uncertain about whether he should interrupt our intense conversation. I gestured for him to enter, realizing that this was the perfect moment for another revelation. "Christopher," I said, "I'd like you to meet my family, and I'd like them to understand something about the service they've been receiving." He approached the table with his characteristic warm professionalism. "It's been my pleasure serving you all this evening and during your previous visits." "Christopher," I said, "can you tell my family about the changes in service policies since I became the owner?" His face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "Mrs. Vasquez has transformed this restaurant in ways that have made my job so much more rewarding. We're now encouraged to engage with customers' questions, to share information about the food and wine, and to accommodate special requests whenever possible." "How has that affected your experience as a server?" Isabella asked. "It's made all the difference," he replied. "Instead of trying to rush tables through their meals, I can focus on creating experiences that customers genuinely enjoy. Instead of discouraging questions, I can share knowledge that enhances their appreciation for the food. Instead of making people feel judged, I can make them feel welcomed." Miguel looked at Christopher with new understanding. "So, when Mom was asking all those questions during our previous visits, that was actually the kind of engagement you prefer?" "Absolutely," Christopher said. "Customers who are curious about the food, who want to understand the preparation methods, who are excited about trying new things, those are the interactions that make this job meaningful." Carmen shook her head slowly. "We completely misunderstood what was happening."
We thought Elena's behavior was inappropriate for the setting, but the setting was inappropriate for human curiosity and enthusiasm. After Christopher returned to his duties, we continued our conversation over dessert and coffee. The documents I'd shared painted a clear picture of the restaurant's transformation, but more importantly, they documented a fundamental shift in how hospitality could be approached. "Mom," Isabella said, "I need to apologize, not just for what Carmen and I said in that restroom, but for years of making you feel like you needed to change to fit into these spaces." "We all need to apologize," Miguel added. "We bought into a system that valued exclusion over inclusion, that prioritized appearance over authentic engagement. The question is," I said, "what are you going to do with this understanding? How will this change how you approach other situations where people might be judged for not conforming to artificial social standards?" Carmen nodded thoughtfully. "I think about all the times I've judged people at restaurants, at social events, at business functions. How many times have I made assumptions about appropriateness when I should have been appreciating genuine enthusiasm?" "And I think about my colleagues," Isabella added. "How often have I participated in conversations about people not belonging in certain spaces, when I should have been questioning why those spaces were designed to exclude people in the first place?" The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from business ethics to family dynamics to social responsibility. But what struck me most was how genuinely my family seemed to be processing these realizations. This wasn't just about admitting they'd been wrong about restaurant etiquette. It was about examining fundamental assumptions about social class, belonging, and the value of different types of human expression. "Elena," Carmen said as we prepared to leave, "what you've accomplished here goes far beyond business success. You've created a model for how institutions can change to become more inclusive without sacrificing quality or standards. You've also shown us something about courage," Miguel added. "It took incredible strength to turn that hurtful experience in the bathroom into motivation for this kind of positive change." As we walked through the main dining room toward the exit, I noticed my family observing the restaurant with completely different eyes than they'd had during previous visits. They were seeing the genuine warmth in staff interactions, the comfort level of diverse customers, and the energy of an environment where curiosity and enthusiasm were welcomed, rather than merely tolerated.
I have one more thing to show you, I said, leading them toward the front entrance where a small plaque had been installed next to the door. The bronze plaque read, Romano's Italian Bistro is committed to creating exceptional dining experiences for all guests through genuine hospitality, inclusive service, and celebration of culinary curiosity. We believe that enthusiasm for food and wine enhances rather than diminishes the fine dining experience. Isabella read the plaque out loud, then turned to me with tears in her eyes. Mom, this is beautiful, and it's exactly right. It's our mission statement, I said. It represents everything I learned from being made to feel unwelcome in places where I should have been celebrated for my genuine interest in the experience. The drive home that evening gave me time to process the success of the Revelation dinner. My family had not only accepted responsibility for their previous judgments, they'd embraced the broader implications of what I had accomplished. They understood that this was never really about restaurant ownership or business success. It was about challenging systems that excluded people for arbitrary reasons. But more importantly, they seemed genuinely committed to applying these insights to other areas of their lives. Carmen talked about reconsidering her assumptions about appropriate behavior at social events. Isabella mentioned wanting to create more inclusive environments in her workplace. Miguel discussed how these principles could apply to patient interactions in his medical practice. Over the following weeks, I watched as my family began implementing their new understanding in various contexts. Carmen invited a wider range of people to her holiday party, including neighbors she'd previously considered too different from her social circle. Isabella advocated for policy changes at her company that would make workplace events more welcoming to employees from diverse backgrounds. Most significantly, they began inviting me to participate in social activities they'd previously avoided sharing with me. Instead of steering me away from upscale restaurants, they started seeking out establishments where we could enjoy learning about food and wine together. Instead of managing my enthusiasm, they began sharing it. The transformation wasn't limited to family dynamics either. Word of Romano's success under new ownership spread throughout the local business community, and I began receiving inquiries from other restaurant owners interested in implementing similar policy changes. The model I'd developed wasn't just working for my establishments, it was inspiring broader changes in the industry. 6 months after the Revelation dinner, I was invited to speak at a conference for restaurant industry professionals about inclusive hospitality practices. Standing before an audience of owners, managers, and servers, I shared the story of how personal experience with exclusionary practices had motivated me to create business models based on inclusion. The restaurant industry has an opportunity to lead by example, I told the audience. We can create spaces where people feel welcome to engage authentically with food, wine, and hospitality without fear of judgment. We can build businesses that succeed by celebrating rather than constraining human curiosity and enthusiasm. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with multiple attendees requesting consultation services to help them implement similar changes in their own establishments. The model I developed wasn't just working for my establishments, it was inspiring broader changes in the industry. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the continued evolution of my relationship with my family. Our monthly dinners at Romano's became celebrations of everything we were learning together about food, wine, and hospitality. Instead of worrying about appropriate behavior, we focused on genuine engagement with the experience and with each other. Mom, Isabella said during one of these dinners, I want you to know that what happened in that bathroom was the best thing that ever happened to our family. I looked around the table at the faces of the people I loved most, seeing genuine happiness and engagement that had been missing during our previous restaurant experiences. Why do you say that? Because it forced us to confront our assumptions about appropriateness and belonging. It made us realize that we'd been judging you based on artificial standards that served no one well.
Carmen nodded in agreement. And it showed us that real sophistication isn't about following arbitrary rules. It's about creating environments where people can express genuine enthusiasm and curiosity without fear of judgment. Miguel raised his wine glass in a toast. To Mom, for having the courage to transform hurt into positive change, and for teaching us that inclusion isn't just morally right, it's also good business. As we clinked glasses around the table, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. What had begun as devastating evidence of family judgment had become an opportunity to examine and change systems that excluded people for the wrong reasons. The restaurants I now owned weren't just more profitable and successful than they'd been under previous management. They were also spaces where people could experience the joy of discovery, the pleasure of learning, and the satisfaction of genuine hospitality. But more importantly, my family had learned something valuable about the difference between artificial sophistication and authentic engagement. They'd discovered that enthusiasm and curiosity were qualities to be celebrated rather than managed, and they'd committed to applying that understanding in all areas of their lives. Standing in Romano's that evening, surrounded by the warmth of genuine hospitality and the love of family members who finally understood what I'd been trying to teach them all along, I realized that the best revenge really was living well and helping others do the same. 2 years had passed since that revelation dinner, and I stood in the newly renovated flagship location of Romano's, watching the evening service unfold with a satisfaction that never seemed to fade. The restaurant had become something I'd never imagined when I first purchased it in anger and hurt. It had become a beacon for inclusive hospitality in our city, and tonight we were celebrating our 2nd anniversary under new ownership. The celebration wasn't just about business success, though the numbers were impressive. Revenue had increased by 60%, we'd expanded to 2 additional locations, and we'd been featured in 3 national restaurant publications as an example of how fine dining could evolve to serve modern customers. More importantly, we'd created a culture that other establishments were actively trying to replicate. I watched as servers moved through the dining room with genuine warmth, engaging enthusiastically with tables full of first-time fine diners celebrating anniversaries, business professionals hosting important clients, and elderly couples rediscovering their love of trying new cuisines. Every interaction reflected the values I'd fought to implement. Curiosity was welcomed, questions were encouraged, and enthusiasm was celebrated rather than managed. At table 15, I observed a scene that perfectly captured what we'd accomplished. A young couple, clearly nervous about their first visit to an upscale restaurant, was being guided through the wine list by their server with patience and genuine interest. Instead of the subtle intimidation tactics that had once been standard here, the server was making them feel sophisticated for asking questions and adventurous for wanting to try something new. Mrs. Vasquez, Marcus approached with his evening report. We're completely booked for the next 3 months, and the waiting list for Saturday nights extends into next year. And how's staff retention? I asked, though I already knew the answer would be positive. 95% over the past 18 months, he said with pride. The servers tell me they've never worked in an environment where they felt so supported in providing genuine hospitality. The success had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. 3 months earlier, I'd received a call from the James Beard Foundation asking if I'd consider applying for their Outstanding Restaurateur Award. The application process had required me to articulate the philosophy behind our transformation, and writing it had helped me understand how far we'd all come. But the most meaningful recognition had come from customers whose dining experiences had been fundamentally changed by what we'd created. Letters arrived regularly from people who'd felt welcome in upscale restaurants for the first time, families who'd discovered the joy of culinary exploration, and individuals who'd found the confidence to engage authentically with fine dining. My family had become some of our most enthusiastic ambassadors, but more importantly, they'd carried the lessons learned here into every aspect of their lives. Carmen had completely transformed her approach to social entertaining, creating events that celebrated diverse backgrounds and perspectives rather than enforcing conformity. Isabella had been promoted twice at her technology company, partly based on her ability to create inclusive workplace environments that encouraged innovation through diverse viewpoints.
Miguel had taken the principles even further, establishing a program at his hospital that trained medical staff to engage more effectively with patients from different cultural backgrounds. He'd learned that the same curiosity and enthusiasm I'd brought to restaurant dining could be applied to healthcare, creating better outcomes through more genuine human connection. Tonight's celebration dinner included not just my family, but several of the staff members who'd been instrumental in implementing our new culture, local food writers who documented our transformation, and representatives from other restaurants that had adopted similar inclusive practices. It felt like a culmination of everything we'd worked toward, but also like the beginning of something even larger. Elena, Carmen approached as I stood observing the dining room. I wanted you to know that Roberto and I have been talking about your model for our own business. Carmen and Roberto owned a small marketing firm that worked primarily with luxury brands, and I'd been curious how our restaurant principles might translate to their industry. What kind of changes are you considering? I asked. We've realized that we've been unconsciously excluding potential clients who didn't fit our preconceived notions about sophistication and refinement. We're restructuring our client consultation process to focus on authentic engagement rather than cultural signaling. It was exactly the kind of broader application I'd hoped our restaurant experiment would inspire. The principles we'd proven in hospitality were applicable to any industry that served diverse populations, and watching my family implement these insights in their own professional contexts felt more rewarding than any business award. Isabella joined our conversation, carrying 2 glasses of the wine we'd selected for tonight's celebration. Mom, I wanted to share something with you. Last month, our company hosted a client event at a restaurant downtown, and I found myself evaluating their service through the lens of what I'd learned here. What did you observe? I asked. That they were making the same mistakes Romanos used to make. They were subtly discouraging questions, rushing certain types of customers, and creating an atmosphere where only people who already knew the rules felt comfortable. Did you say anything? I did, she said with a smile that reminded me of her childhood determination. I spoke with the manager afterward and shared some of the strategies you'd implemented here. They were actually very interested in learning more. These conversations were happening throughout the city as people who'd experienced our transformed restaurant began questioning exclusionary practices in other contexts. The ripple effects extended far beyond the hospitality industry, touching everything from retail customer service to professional networking events.
As dinner service reached its peak, I noticed a familiar face entering the restaurant. Dr. Sarah Chen, the cardiologist who'd helped me document my health during the early stages of my restaurant acquisition, was being seated with what appeared to be her extended family. I watched as their server approached the table with the warmth and enthusiasm that had become our signature. The server began explaining our philosophy of encouraging questions and customizing experiences, and I could see Dr. Chen's surprised delight as she realized this was exactly the kind of environment where her elderly parents would feel comfortable exploring new cuisines. Her father, who appeared to be in his 80s, began asking detailed questions about ingredients and preparation methods, and instead of impatience, he was met with genuine enthusiasm from our staff. That's what it's all about, I murmured to myself, watching 3 generations of a family discover the joy of collaborative dining. Marcus approached with an update that brought even more satisfaction. Mrs. Vasquez, I wanted to let you know that we've received formal requests from 12 other restaurant groups asking for consultation services. They want to implement similar culture change initiatives. The demand for our expertise had led to the creation of Inclusive Hospitality Consulting, a separate division of our company that worked with restaurants, hotels, and other service industries to eliminate exclusionary practices. We developed training programs, policy frameworks, and measurement tools that allowed other businesses to create more welcoming environments for diverse customers. There's something else, Marcus continued. The National Restaurant Association has asked you to deliver the keynote address at their annual conference next spring. They want you to speak about how inclusive practices can drive both social good and business success.
The invitation represented validation from the industry establishment, but more importantly, it offered an opportunity to influence practices across thousands of establishments nationwide. The message I'd developed through personal experience and business experimentation was resonating far beyond what I'd ever imagined possible. As the evening celebration continued, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this moment. What had begun as a devastating overheard conversation in a restaurant bathroom had evolved into a movement that was changing how entire industries thought about customer service and inclusion. The hurt I'd felt that night seemed like it belonged to a different lifetime, experienced by a different person. The woman who'd cried alone in that elegant restroom had been focused on fitting into existing systems rather than questioning whether those systems served anyone well. The woman I'd become had learned that real power came not from conforming to exclusionary standards, but from creating new standards that celebrated human authenticity. "Mom," Miguel approached as the evening began winding down, "Sophia and I have an announcement we wanted to share with the family." He took Sophia's hand, and I could see the happiness radiating from both of them. "We're engaged," he said simply, "and we want to have our engagement party here at Romano's. Not just because it's a beautiful restaurant, but because this place represents everything we believe about creating welcoming spaces where people can be authentically themselves." Their announcement brought tears to my eyes, not just because of my happiness for them, but because of what their choice represented. They weren't selecting Romano's despite my connection to it. They were choosing it because of the values it embodied, values they wanted to celebrate as they began their life together. As the celebration concluded and our guests began departing, I stood once more in the dining room that had become the symbol of my transformation. The space looked elegant and sophisticated, but it felt warm and welcoming. The service was impeccable, but it encouraged engagement rather than intimidation. The food was exceptional, but it was presented in ways that educated and inspired rather than excluding and mystifying. "Elena," Carmen approached for our final conversation of the evening, "I need to tell you something I should have said months ago." I turned to face my sister, curious about what she wanted to share. "What you accomplished here goes beyond business success or even social change," she said. "You taught all of us that real sophistication isn't about excluding people or following arbitrary rules. It's about creating spaces where everyone can experience joy, discovery, and genuine connection." Her words captured something essential about what we'd achieved. Romano's had become sophisticated, in the truest sense of the word, not because it enforced exclusionary standards, but because it had eliminated barriers that prevented people from engaging authentically with exceptional experiences. As I locked the restaurant that night, I thought about the woman who'd purchased these establishments 2 years earlier, driven by hurt and anger and a determination to prove her critics wrong. That woman had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams, but she had also discovered something more valuable than vindication. She had learned that the most satisfying victories were those that created opportunities for others to succeed as well. The restaurants I now owned were profitable, acclaimed, and influential. But more importantly, they were spaces where curiosity was rewarded, enthusiasm was celebrated, and every customer could experience the joy of discovery without fear of judgment. They had become exactly what I dreamed fine dining could be when I was a little girl pressing my nose against restaurant windows, wondering what it would feel like to belong. Now I knew. Belonging wasn't about conforming to someone else's standards. It was about creating spaces where everyone could be authentically themselves while experiencing the very best that human creativity and hospitality had to offer. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.